This PowerPoint's going to introduce some of the key terms and ideas in the study of economics. First term is going to be incentives. Now, you can view incentives as what there is to be gained from an action or from refraining from an action. As an example, the incentives for going to work could be enjoying the work itself or the paycheck you collect for going to work. The economic way of thinking is a way of looking at certain problems through the lens of incentives and trade-offs to determine which outcomes would be preferred. So using this type of analysis, you can reach some informed conclusions on things you see in the news or things going on in your own personal life. Truly, the economic way of thinking is a framework that you can apply to nearly any decision you have to make. Economics has been defined in several ways, but a couple of good, concise definitions for economics could be the study of how people allocate their limited resources to satisfy their unlimited wants, or the study of how people make choices. And by resources, we just mean the standard definition of things that you use to produce other things, and wants also goes by the standard definition. In using economics, we try to balance these two. So with limited income, people must make choices to satisfy their wants. So anytime you want to buy something and only have a certain amount of money, you have to decide whether or not that thing's worth the money you'd have to spend on it, or whether or not you'd prefer to spend that money on something else. Everybody faces these decisions, and not just individuals, but groups of individuals as well. And then the study of how these choices are made is economics. There are two main branches of economic study. Microeconomics is the study of decision making undertaken by individuals or smaller groups that operate within larger groups. The second branch is macroeconomics, and this is where you're collecting all of these various groups that we studied in microeconomics into larger groups, or looking at large groups on the whole. Macroeconomics typically deals with aggregates or totals, where we're using output such as GDP or the inflation rate in the economy. But modern economic theory tries to blend these two concepts, where we start by building a model off of micro groups into larger effects, such as a whole economy's output. Economic systems are the institutional mechanisms that govern the incentives and actions of human actors. So you can think of these like actual laws or informal institutions like cultural or religious rules. We're going to focus on three major economic questions. They are: what and how much will be produced, how will items be produced, and for whom will items be produced. We can typically collect the responses to these questions into two opposing categories. Centralized command and control. This is where authority makes most of the economic decisions. Or a price system or a market system. And this is where decentralized decision making is conducted through prices. In general, most sets of economic systems across the world are some combination of the two, and we call these mixed systems. As an example, China has operated with two different economic systems. One in which the government-owned enterprises were largely relied on for the production needs of the economy, and another where private businesses were in charge of deciding what, how, and for whom production should take place. In economic analysis, we often assume that individuals act as if they are motivated by self-interest and respond in predictable ways. This idea is well summed up in Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, where he says, "It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interests." This is the rationality assumption, That's the assumption that people don't intentionally make decisions that would leave them worse off. As a simple concrete example, imagine you were offered a $10 bill or a $20 bill. The rationality assumption would just say that you're always going to choose the $20 bill. Now, this assumption seems reasonable, but there are certainly some questions that go along with it. First, does the fact that some people make apparently irrational choices invalidate the rationality assumption in economics? Also, can economic models be applied to situations in which behavior is at odds with what we expect from rational people? Rationality is where we assume that people respond rationally to incentives. There are two distinct types of incentives. In general, we can consider positive incentives some type of reward, or negative incentives some type of punishment. We make choices by balancing these incentives and their costs and benefits. Here are some examples of incentives. A couple of positive incentives would be gold stars given to school children when they do good work, or the better life you receive for working hard. A couple of negative incentives would be penalties or punishments, or using credit cards to avoid check overdrafts. Now's a good time to define what we mean by self-interest. It's the pursuit of one's goals. It can be anything that you value. It doesn't have to be strictly money. An example of self-interest that may not seem obvious at first is the fact that U.S. residents give about 2% of their incomes to charities. This isn't against self-interest so long as we assume that people enjoy some part of the well-being of others. Economics is a social science, and we attempt to employ the same types of methods that are used in natural sciences like biology or chemistry. Typically, we use models to try to explain certain phenomena that we recognize in the world. These models or theories are just simplified representations of the real world, and we use them to make predictions. When we're making these models, we hope that they capture just the essential relationships while leaving out things that aren't necessarily important. In order to reach a level of simplicity that makes a model useful, every model must start with assumptions. These are just circumstances that we believe to be true when we start creating our model. An example of a common model that you would be familiar with could be a map. A map just simplifies reality. The degree of simplification varies across maps. For instance, some maps have every bend in a river. Other maps only have the major turns. As long as that map shows you the information you need, then it's a successful model. Economic models attempt to focus on what is relevant to the problem at hand and leave out the unimportant parts. When creating and working with a model, the assumption of ceteris paribus, or other things equal, is essential. When studying a model and looking at how things change with a particular variable, we're really interested in only that variable moving so that we can be relatively confident that the effects are based off of that variable. Economics is an empirical science. We're using actual data from the world to verify or estimate how accurate our models are at predicting these phenomena that we're studying. Behavioral economics is a branch of economics that tries to merge psychology and economics together. In this branch, we're looking at how psychological limitations complicate the ways that consumers make decisions. Some of the issues that proponents of behavioral economics hope to correct are unbounded selfishness, unbounded willpower, and unbounded rationality, suggesting that people aren't all-knowing. Bounded rationality is the hypothesis that people are nearly, but not entirely rational. That is, they don't know all the possibilities when it comes to a decision, and they use rules of thumb to sort of make decisions without having all the available information. Some governments are using the insights gained from behavioral economics to nudge their citizens into behaviors that they think are better for them. For instance, a law in the United Kingdom requires people to contribute a pension plan unless they consciously opt out of it. This has seen an uptick in the percent of participation in these pension plans. Another concern we have with economics is what it can actually tell us. There are two types of thinking. Positive economics suggests that we learn exactly what is from economics with no value judgments involved. That is, if this happens, then this happens. Normative economics also involves value judgments. That would be, if this happens, then this happens, and that's a good thing, or that's a bad thing. This slide describes an economic decision faced by the NBA player Dwight Howard. When choosing between a salary of $23.6 million a year in Los Angeles or a salary of $22 million a year in Houston, he also has to consider other questions. In the end, after considering the taxes paid in Los Angeles, his decision is to move to Houston because he actually makes more despite his net salary being higher in Los Angeles. In this example, we see some issues that students face when taking out student loans.